nasty crimes. This man was quoted saying that he had murdered a child in every single state. Albert Fish was, trigger warning, rape and child sexual assault on children. So this man was a cannibal. He was a rapist, a pedophile, obviously. And today I have this article going over him, and it's basically him and his confession as well, because he did confess to a lot. If I can just do this gently. So the gruesome crimes of Albert Fish, the Brooklyn vampire. Albert Fish confessed to dozens of crimes after his arrest, each of them more depraved than the last. By November of 1934, 10-year-old Grace Budd had been missing for 6 years. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, but 6. I'm not laughing at the fact that she was gone for 6 years, by the way. I'm laughing because my fingers just look funny. There had been no promising clues or developments regarding her disappearance. That is until her mother, Delia Flanagan Budd, received an anonymous letter. Now, let's just pause there. As a mother myself, if my child were missing for even 10 minutes, I would go crazy if I didn't know who was watching them or where they were. And the fact that her child was gone for 6 years and then gets this creepy ass letter. I mean, no thank you. It's just traumatic. It's traumatizing, honestly. Dear Mrs. Budd, it read, on Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. The bizarre, rambling letter that Mrs. Budd received. It began with the tale of a deckhand who developed a taste for human flesh. And it ended in this harrowing description of Mrs. Budd's daughter being murdered and roasted like in the oven. And although the written confession was unsigned and nameless, it was the beginning of the end for cannibalistic serial killer Albert Fish. small, quiet, and unassuming. He had a face that blended in with the crowd, and this private life that would have frightened even the most hardened criminals. As a child, Fish was, he was like plagued by mental illness. He had a lot of things going on in his head, as were a number of his family members as well. And not only was his brother in an asylum, but his uncle had been diagnosed with mania, while his mother routinely experienced visual hallucinations. His father was 75 years old at the time of Fish's birth and died when Albert was just 5 years old. That just starts off your life pretty shitty, having such an old father. Honestly, I'm sorry, but that seems kind of selfish, in my opinion. His father was this old man, 75, when he had him. Well, he didn't have him, his mom had him. And his widowed mother didn't have the resources to take care of Albert and his 3 siblings alone. So she left them with the state orphanage. It was there that he conceived this passion for pain. The caretakers at the orphanage regularly beat those children, and even occasionally pegged on the kids to kind of beat each other. And while the children lived in fear of painful punishments, Fish reveled in them. I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong, Fish later recalled. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done. He came to enjoy and associate pain with pleasure, which would later seep into sexual gratification. When his mother became mentally stable and financially self-sufficient enough to take him home in 1880, she removed him from the orphanage altogether. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Fish not only continued to administer pain onto himself, but began this unhealthy relationship with a telegraph boy in 1882. The child introduced him to a sexual practice known as urolagnia. And this is pretty gross, but anyways, it's the consumption of eating your own uno and dos. Okay, that's all I'm gonna say. So eventually, his sadomasochistic tendencies led him to an obsession with self-mutilation. He would regularly embed needles into his groin and abdomen and flog himself with this nail-studded paddle. He would beat his own self. And in 1890, after a 20-year-old Fish moved to New York City, his crimes against children began. descriptions of the affair, Fish would hint that Kendal was perhaps intellectually disabled. Only 10 days after their initial meeting, Fish actually lured Kendal over to this abandoned farmhouse with this idea that he was going to do some assignation. When Kendal arrived, however, he found himself locked inside. For 2 weeks, Fish tortured Kendal. The budding killer mutilated the other man's body and cut off, trigger warning if you're a guy, cut off half of the downstairs area person thing down there. Then, as suddenly as he had arrived, Fish disappeared, leaving Kendal with this $10 bill for his trouble. I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me, Fish later recalled. By 1917, Fish was having difficulty concealing the symptoms of severe mental illness, leading his wife to say bye-bye and left him for another man. Fish's self-harm grew thereafter, from pressing more and more needles into his groin to stuffing wool covered in lighter fluid into his butt. And then he would legitimately set it on fire. I don't know what this man's problem was, but that is some wild, wild shit. He began having auditory hallucinations as well. And at one point, he recalled wrapping himself in a carpet on the instructions of John the Apostle. Fish began teaching his own children strange and oddly sadomasochistic games before developing an obsession with cannibalism. As a precursor to consuming human flesh, he began to eat raw meat, like from the grocery store. Just eats it raw. And he often invited his kids to eat the raw meat as well. By 1919, his obsession with this torture and cannibalism had brought him to contemplate murder. He began to look for vulnerable children, such as intellectually disabled orphans or homeless African American children. Youths that he assumed would not be missed. He would claim at his trial and in later writings that God was speaking to him, commanding him to torture and consume these young children, as if God would want him to do that. He scoured advertisements in local papers put out by families looking for someone to perform some housework, or by young men looking for work themselves, and that's how he would kind of get his guys to come over. It was through one of these advertisements that he found Grace Budd, and Grace wasn't always Albert Fish's intended target. It was her older brother, actually, that he had his sights on. Edward Budd was looking for work on a farm or in the country. That's why he put out the ad Fish encountered. So Fish originally was planning on hiring Edward, and bringing him out to his country house to actually torture him. Thus, under the false name Frank sister, and she was standing there just behind her parents. Now, he had this new plan, and he didn't waste any time. He actually ended up inviting Grace along and saying to the parents of the kids, "Hey, I am going to my niece's birthday party. I'm sure they would love it if I brought to the kids. Grace, would you like to come?" And he was kind of, getting their approval and speaking about his fictitious farm. And he kind of gained their trust, I believe, because they were convinced. So Delia and Albert allowed their daughter to be taken, and they never saw her again. Fish took Grace, dressed in her Sunday best, to his house upstate, the same one he had intended to use as a torture chamber for her brother. According to the letter sent to Delia Budd along with his confession, Fish hid in an upstairs bedroom naked so as not to get blood on his clothing, while Grace picked wildflowers in the yard. Then he called her inside. When she screamed at the sight of him, he grabbed her before she could flee. As his gruesome letter read, "First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body." The letter, which had clearly been intended to cause panic within the Budd home, hastened Albert Fish's downfall. The paper had written the letter on what happened to be a piece of stationery from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Police inquired with the company and found that the paper had been left behind by a janitor from the company at a rooming house he'd been staying at. At the same rooming house, a man named Albert Fish was renting a place. Upon learning that Fish bore a strong resemblance to else back. That was just the end of it for him. But the 2 other murders were linked to him after his arrest, and unsurprisingly, they're just as gruesome. Just as gruesome. According to Crime Museum, Albert Fish is believed to be responsible for the murder of a 4-year-old boy named Billy Gaffney. And Billy had disappeared while playing with a neighbor in Brooklyn on February 11th, 1927. That child would later tell police that the boogeyman took Billy. So that's where the name boogeyman comes. The 3-year-old boy described this boogeyman as a slender, elderly type of man with gray hair and a gray mustache. At first, cops didn't take the child seriously, but when they reached all over the neighborhood with no clues, they finally realized he had been abducted and he was never seen again. But after Fish's arrest, a motorman on a Brooklyn trolley line came forward to identify him as a nervous old man he saw on the same day Billy had disappeared. Apparently, the old man was trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him in this trolley, and he was crying out for his mother. The man then dragged the boy off onto the trolley. Fish admitted to the kidnapping and murder of Billy in a sickening detail. So, I don't know if I should go into it again. I think with the other child that was enough. I don't really want to read this. But I think that I'm just gonna not really read that, because I don't even want to read it again. As a mom, I always say that, but it's just, I'm rubbing my belly. It makes me want to hold my babies tighter. It's scary people out there. Although no one was ever able to find Billy's remains, people were able to locate the body of Fish's 3rd confirmed victim relatively quickly, actually. In 1924, a young boy named Francis McDonnell vanished while playing. He was with his brother and a group of friends, and they lived in Staten Island at the time. His body was found in the woods shortly thereafter, and he had been strangled by his own suspenders. Poor little boy. Shortly after Albert Fish was put to death, he confessed to being the one who lured Francis into the woods, later assaulting and strangling him. He admitted that he was ready to dismember the boy, but he thought he heard someone approaching the field, and he kind of fled the scene. The trial for Albert Fish began on March 11th of 1935 and demonstrated quite clearly that the man was insane. As expected, his defense pleaded innocent by, reason of insanity, the huge. And Fish admitted that his auditory hallucinations or whatnot were in the form of these voices in his head, so he had to do it because these voices were telling him. Despite numerous psychiatrists involved in the trial supporting the insanity plea, however, the jury found Fish sane enough to Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York, wherever that is. Ossining, it's probably Ossining, New York. Fish was permitted to write a series of notes regarding his crimes. These would help reporters, reporters that were covering these gruesome cases more properly and in better detail, I guess. And they kind of wanted this first-hand kind of thing to entice the readers to hear it straight from the source. While it's generally believed he killed anywhere between 3 and 9 victims, Fish himself had another figure in his mind. His chilling claim that he had a child in every state remains unconfirmed. Meanwhile, the man's detailed recollections from prison have never been released. Before his execution on January 16th, 1936, Albert Fish's attorney, Jack Dempsey, refused to share his client's notes. It only took one glance at them to determine that what Fish had described was too macabre for the public consumption. Like, it was just way too graphic, way too much. "I will never show it to anyone," he said. "It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." You heard it. You heard it from him, his own attorney. You won't even read it. So this serial killer thing I'm gonna be doing is kind of like a spotlight series, and I forget which YouTuber does it, but I think they do true crime, and it's like serial killer spotlight, something like that. And I kind of wanted to do the same thing, so once in a while for my true crime videos, I'm going to be focusing on a serial killer and kind of their crazy shenanigans. So, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure that you subscribe, and comment. Let me know if you enjoyed this kind of take on it, more focusing on the killer, which I don't think I ever wanted to do, but I thought that this man was just wild. I could go even into more detail about him, but he's crazy, and it could get too graphic, But if you do like it, and I will talk to you guys later. Have a good one. Sleep well. If you're not going to sleep,